Hello, and welcome to the turbulent world with me, James M. Dorsey, as your host. Israeli Prime Minister Binyamin Netanyahu is tying himself up in knots as he grudgingly, and only to a limited degree, bows to U.S. President Joe Biden's demands. In doing so, Mr. Netanyahu is puncturing Swiss cheese-sized holes into Israel's Gaza narrative, making it easier for Mr. Biden to take him publicly to task. Mr. Biden has demanded that Israel allow the unfettered flow of desperately needed humanitarian aid into Gaza, an immediate ceasefire linked to an exchange of Hamas-held hostages for Palestinians incarcerated in Israel, and the dropping of Israeli plans for a ground offensive in the southern Gazan city of Rafah, home to more than 1 million Palestinians displaced by the 6-month-long war. In recent days, Mr. Netanyahu has granted entry into Gaza to more than 1,200 aid trucks, significantly reduced Israel's on-the-ground military presence in the Strip, and raised to 150,000 the number of displaced Palestinians that would be allowed to return without Israeli security checks to their often destroyed homes in the north of the territory. In addition, Mr. Netanyahu has played games with Rafah by claiming that he has set an undisclosed date for a ground offensive, even though Israeli officials are still discussing his plans with their U.S. counterparts, and his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, insists that there is no date for the operation. Even so, Mr. Gallant said the withdrawal of Israeli forces was to prepare for an offensive in Rafah. Israel asserts that Hamas's remaining 4 armed brigades are in Rafah. It also suspects that Hamas's top leadership, including Yahya Sinwar, Israel's most wanted man, is hiding in tunnels under Rafah, shielded by many of the Hamas-held hostages still alive. The contradictions in Israeli statements on Rafah reflect the knots tying up Mr. Netanyahu and the holes punctured by Israel in the Prime Minister and the government's narrative. By asserting that he set a date, Mr. Netanyahu hopes to pacify his ultra-nationalist coalition partners who threaten to topple the government if the Prime Minister fails to launch an offensive. At the same time, Mr. Netanyahu is attempting to engineer a situation in which he can blame Mr. Biden if he decides not to commence ground operations in Gaza and/or for Israel's overall failure to achieve its war objectives, including the destruction of Hamas and ensuring that the Strip no longer will be a launching pad for Palestinian resistance. Many suspect Mr. Netanyahu of wanting to continue the war to extend his fragile political life. He is likely betting that his far-right partners may not make good on their threat, given opinion polls that suggest a new election would not return them or the Prime Minister to office. The far right may not be the only threat to the longevity of Mr. Netanyahu's government. Depending on how Mr. Biden and Hamas play their cards in ceasefire and prisoner exchange negotiations, Mr. Netanyahu could see a split in his war cabinet, from which the far right is excluded. A tough-talking politician and retired general, Mr. Gallant suggested that Israel could be flexible in the negotiations. The defense minister asserted that we have the absolute commitment to bringing our hostages home, and the operational circumstances created by the Israel Defense Forces' constant pressure on Hamas and our position of power achieved in battle allow us flexibility, freedom of movement, and the ability to make difficult decisions. Mr. Gallant added that there will be difficult decisions, and we are prepared to pay a price to release the hostages. Israeli officials said neither Mr. Netanyahu nor Mr. Gallant had advanced knowledge of this week's killing of 3 sons and 4 grandchildren of Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas's political bureau and a ceasefire negotiator. The attack came as Mr. Biden called on Hamas to accept a ceasefire proposal put forward by CIA Director Bill Burns. Hamas says it is studying the proposal, even though Israel's response fails to address its demands. Essentially, Mr. Burns' proposal is a revival of a suggestion first crafted in January by U.S. and Egyptian intelligence chiefs and Qatar's Prime Minister in consultation with the head of Israel's Mossad Foreign Intelligence Service. The proposal called for a 3-stage, 90-day ceasefire, a phased prisoner exchange, and permanent ceasefire talks in the second stage. The Burns proposal envisions the exchange of 40 Hamas-held captives abducted during its October 7 attack on Israel for 900 Palestinians in Israeli prisons. Hamas abducted 250 people in October, more than 100 of which were swapped in November for 240 Palestinians incarcerated in Israel. Under the new U.S. proposal, Hamas would have to compromise on the number and identity of the prisoners they want released, while Israel would have to make concessions on the return of displaced Palestinian civilians to northern Gaza. The CIA director's proposal goes some way to meet Hamas's demands for a permanent ceasefire, a complete Israeli troop withdrawal, the unfettered flow of aid into Gaza, and the return of displaced Palestinians to their homes in the north. Mr. Netanyahu and Israel's problem is that appearing to comply with Mr. Biden's demands, including facilitating a ceasefire agreement, is self-incriminating. A renewed prisoner exchange amounts to an admission that 6 months of military action has failed to free the hostages, and in effect, hands Hamas a victory. For Mr. Netanyahu, that is a double-edged sword. While a prisoner exchange would take some of the stings out of the growing domestic public demands that he prioritize the release of the hostages, it would likely encourage mass demonstrations demanding the Prime Minister's resignation. Moreover, the entry into Gaza this week of more than 1,200 aid trucks in 3 days is evidence that Israeli restrictions constitute the main obstacle and cause of the humanitarian food and medical crisis, rather than international organizations' lack of capacity, a breakdown of law and order in Gaza, or allegations that Hamas hijacks aid convoys, even if all of that plays a role. Moreover, while Israel's failed attempt to incite a popular revolt against Hamas by depriving Gazans of the basics of life is the main reason for the crisis threatening the lives of innocent Palestinians, it is not the only culprit. Hamas, like Israel and the West Bank-based Palestine Authority, Hamas's arch-rival, sees aid distribution as a battleground that will shape the contours of the post-war administration of the Strip. While humanitarian organizations will not surrender control of distribution, Hamas believes it should play a role in securing the movement of aid trucks in Gaza and maintaining a semblance of law and order. Hamas believes Israel is attempting to circumvent the group by approaching Gazan clan leaders and businessmen who have no ties to the Islamists, as well as, albeit reluctantly, senior Palestine Authority intelligence officials to assist in securing and distributing aid. Recently, Hamas detained 6 authority representatives, 2 of whom were killed reportedly when Hamas fighters opened fire. The officials were escorting aid convoys organized by the authority in cooperation with the Egyptian Red Crescent that Hamas sought to prevent from traveling in the Strip. Hamas charged the officials were undercover security operatives seeking to sow chaos and division in Gaza. Israeli journalist Amos Harel noted that two interesting conclusions emerged from this affair. Hamas will use all means available to thwart alternatives to its civil control of the Strip, and the Palestinian Authority is trying to stir the pot behind the scenes, even at the cost of Hamas harming the Authority's own people. Mr. Netanyahu and Israel are also tying themselves up in knots when one compares the wanton death and destruction in Gaza that Israel claims was unavoidable in its effort to take out Hamas with the precision of targeted Israeli strikes against Iranian and Palestinian officials in residential neighborhoods in Lebanon and Syria. Praising the remarkable precision of Israeli attacks on Iranians and Lebanese Hezbollah operatives in Syria, Middle East scholar Andrew Tabler calculated that Israel launched 50 airstrikes on targets in Syria in the last 6 months, killing 50 Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Hezbollah, and Hamas operatives, and 75 Syrians. It is unclear how many innocent civilians were among the Syrian casualties, but even if it all were civilians, that would be a kill ratio of 1.5 Syrians for every operative targeted by Israel. Earlier this month, Israel launched a precise strike against a building in Damascus's upscale Mezze neighborhood, believed to house the Iranian consulate. The strike killed 7 Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives, including Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Zahedi and another senior Iranian commander. The New York Times suggested that the operatives were part of a network smuggling arms into the West Bank. Shin Bet, Israel's domestic intelligence service, said days before the attack that it had discovered an arms cache smuggled into the West Bank. Israel was equally precise in its killing in January in a residential Beirut neighborhood of senior Hamas official Saleh al-Aruri. All 7 people killed by a drone targeting their 3rd-floor office in what appeared to be a 4-story building were Hamas operatives. In Gaza, assuming that 13,000 Palestinian fighters, the number of fighters Israel says it has killed, are included in the Gaza Health Ministry's death count of more than 33,000, the kill ratio would be 1.52. However, the casualty rate is far higher if one takes into account the more than 70,000 wounded and maimed Palestinians, which according to Israel's estimate would include less than 17,000 fighters, based on its estimate that Hamas had 30 fighters under arms at the outset of the Gaza war. Those casualty figures are stark, even if one allows for urban fighting and the added complication of Hamas's underground tunnel system. The contrast has much to do with geopolitical and military restraints Israel accepts in Beirut and Damascus in terms of ensuring that conflicts do not spin out of control, and an Israeli military culture in which the number of people killed in Gaza becomes a goal in and of itself, rather than a last resort in the conquest of territory or self-defense. Former Defense Minister and Chief of Staff Moshe Ya'alon, a leader of the protests demanding Mr. Netanyahu's resignation, said, "The rules that I know are that if one of your enemies has his hands up, you don't shoot at him, only in a life-threatening situation. So our interest was all along the fighting in Gaza? That if terrorists surrender, we shot them? When we talk about eliminating and killing, those are the people of Messianic Judaism and the Jewish superiority. They want a territory clean of Arabs. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed today's column and podcast. The turbulent world with James M. Dorsey depends on the support of its readers. For the past 12 years, I have maintained free distribution as a way of maximizing impact. I'm determined to keep it that way. However, to avoid putting up a paywall, I need the support of a core of voluntary paid subscribers to cover the cost of producing the column and podcast. If you believe that the column and podcast add value to your understanding and that of the broader public, please consider becoming a paid subscriber. You can do so by clicking on Substack on the subscription button at www.jamesmdorsey.substack.com and choosing one of the subscription options. Thank you, take care, and best wishes.